What's going on, Teach Better fam? It's Chris here, and I am bringing you another bonus episode. In this bonus episode, Jeff Gargas sits down with Katelynn Giordano and Dave Schmittou of the Teach Better team to discuss a really hot topic and meaningful topic in education today, which is grading and assessment. In their conversation, Katelynn, Jeff, and Dave dive deep to discuss the meaning behind grades, the purpose of grades, and how we can all better ourselves and our students' experiences in our classrooms by reevaluating and reflecting on our own grading practices, policies, and assessment strategies. I really hope you enjoy this conversation and get as much out of it as I did. And as always, I encourage you to share this with someone you know who would also enjoy and benefit from this as well. You can always head over to teachbetter.com for additional resources and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook for future talks and episodes like this one. All right, let's get you back to the episode.
All right, welcome to a very, very special episode of Teach Better Talk. And why is it special? It's special because Ray is not here. At least that's how I'm saying it. I'm going to pay for that, you all know, but this is a special bonus episode. So wanted to have a conversation with two of my good friends who seem to always have really, really good conversations between the two of them. And I essentially just wanted to feel smart. So I'm going to let them talk and pretend I said smart things. Dave, Katelynn, does that sound good?
It sounds great. I don't know that we're going to help you sound smart, though, but we'll try our best.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do.
Compared to what everyone's used to, you guys don't have to work very hard. So if you haven't figured out by now, I'm joined today by Dr. David Schmittou and the one and only Katelynn Giordano, or as we call her, the boss. We have both of you. I'm going to have you guys introduce yourself for a minute, but I wanted to have you on because we've got some stuff coming in the future with you guys. Stuff we're not even necessarily going to talk about that, but because there's been multiple times where you have been on screen together and conversations around different things, and the people in our community and our family around just seem to really, really enjoy it. So I thought, hey, let's bring that to the podcast. This could be really fun. I always enjoy it. Like, you guys just go in such cool directions so many times. So I'm hoping that I can spark some of that conversation with you today. This is not pre-planned. We talked very briefly before we hit record, but I really don't know what I'm doing. We're just going to kind of wing it. And I think that's the best way to go here. So before we get into all of that, let's have you both introduce yourself to anybody who doesn't know you that might be listening and meeting you for the first time via voice. Katelynn, why don't you tell everyone who you are?
Well, hi, everybody. I am Katelynn Giordano. I am a 6th grade English and history teacher in the suburbs of Chicago, and I am also the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Teach Better team.
And Dave.
Well, and she's the boss. She didn't even say that. Like, because you can't see Katelynn right now, just picture like that 1984 Bruce Springsteen album. Katelynn's got the little red bandana hanging out of her pocket, and she's staring at you. She's the boss. Yeah. That's who she is. Yeah. And I am not the boss. I am Dave Schmittou, joining you from my basement in Michigan, a place no one wants to be. But I am the Director of Leadership and Development for the Teach Better team, a former teacher, principal, assistant superintendent, college professor, all the things, and just a fan of Katelynn, and I'm glad to tolerate Jeff tonight. So let's do this.
I like it. So I tolerate Jeff today. It's like Ray's here.
Yeah, she's gone, so I got to fill in a little bit. We're good.
she's here in spirit. So I mentioned that we've had you on different live streams and stuff, and people really take into it. And typically it's around a variety of topics, but the one that's really hit and a lot of people really get excited about is when either one of you are speaking on, or when you're both speaking on or against each other, when it comes to talking about things like grading, assessment, that type of stuff. So, and I know that you're both very passionate about that type of stuff. We talk about like poking the bear and having these conversations that can really like rile people up in sometimes almost an aggressive, dangerous way. And I guess the question I want to throw to both of you right now is, we have these conversations. Sometimes they can be very, they can, like I said, get people angry even at each other, frustrated, lead to arguments. So why is it so important right now that we have these conversations around grading and what that means, and around assessment, around feedback, and around the data that we use or don't use, or how we collect it or why we collect it, and all these other things? Why is that important, not just to you, but why is that important for us as a community in education and the world of education to talk about? And Katelynn, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Sure. So I think that when you're talking about any kind of organization, education included, you have to consistently try to make change. And change not just because you should, but change because there are areas that need that change to happen. You mentioned grading and assessment, and that's one of the areas that Dave and I talk a lot about because it's an area that does need so much change. And that change only comes through discomfort. That change only comes through challenging the status quo, through challenging the systems that are currently in place. Because when you're dealing with such a large organization that has so many different people involved and so many different people who are passionately involved, it's going to be uncomfortable to make that change happen. And you have to have people who are those change agents coming in and being willing to kind of poke the bear, to ask those questions, to get those conversations started so that people as a whole and the organization as a whole can start taking those steps. And those steps can be internal, those steps can be small conversations, those steps can then get bigger and bigger as time goes on and kind of just blossom out throughout the entire organization. But it really does start in that place of discomfort, in that place of questioning and challenging and really poking the bear to make things happen.
All right. So Dave, why is it so uncomfortable for us to talk about things like grading and assessment and stuff like that in education? Why is that such an uncomfortable thing?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why it's uncomfortable. Number one, because it confronts what we've always done, and that's always uncomfortable. When someone tells you something or shares with you something that causes you to reflect and realize, okay, maybe there's a different way, a better way that might not be as convenient or as easy as what I've always done. It can be a challenge to confront that and to realize that you might need to shift and adjust. That's number one. But secondly, and probably more importantly, when we're talking grades, when we're talking assessment, ultimately what we're talking about are values. We're having a conversation about what we think is important. We're having a conversation about what we need to measure compared to what somebody else measures, what somebody else values, what somebody else thinks is important. And then when we sit down and we have to reach consensus on values, we're having a debate or a conversation about things that we think are important. We feel like it's our responsibility to try to get everybody else to feel the same way that we do. And that is always awkward. It's always difficult, but it's a conversation we have to have. I'm a firm believer that we have way too many taboo topics in education. So many things that we're afraid to talk about. And grading is one of them. Ironically, grading is right up there with politics and religion. People don't want to talk about grading. I've jokingly said I could walk into a staff room, staff lounge, a staff meeting, and I could drop the data word and get a more visceral reaction than if I drop the F-bomb. Like if you start using the data word, that 4-letter word, I mean, people will give you the death stare because we have misused and misused that for so long. Nowadays, we use grading, we use assessments to label people, to identify people, to say what's good, bad, or ugly, as opposed to what do we need to do next. And it's a dirty conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to happen.
So yeah, I tell you what, from all the time that I've spent in schools and classrooms with teachers and training and workshops and stuff, you're absolutely right. When you mentioned grading, like they clutch that grade book,
yeah.
Like, even if they don't have it with them, even if they don't have it with them, like you see them kind of clutching it because they feel like they have it with them, and it's a touchy subject. So Dave, you mentioned taboo topics. Well, actually, I'm trying to think which way I want to go. Do I want to open the can of taboo topics, or do I want to hone in on this grading and?
Yeah, well, can we go both? Can we do both? Because I don't think you can do one without the other. To be honest with you,
sure, I do, but I want to touch on why it is, and I'm going to leave this to whoever wants to jump in can. But you mentioned, and I think this is real important, Dave, that we're using grades, and we have been for so long to label people, right?
To label everything.
As someone who's been in that system, as when I was a student way back when, that my kids are in it, but I haven't been in a classroom. I wasn't a teacher, so I've never been in that part of it. how did that happen? Like, I don't know. Do we know the history? Like, I gotta assume you both want to do. Like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? And then from there, Dave and Kate both. So then, how do we break that? Like, how do we get past that? Beyond the yes, we have to have the conversation, but what are the actual conversations we have to have in order to break that? But let's go back first and like, how do we even get to this point where we're utilizing this data that should be used to help figure out what kids needs, and now we're using it to label them in certain ways.
Yeah, so the use of letter grades themselves go back to World War II when we were sorting and selecting high school students to go into the military, trying to determine who was fit for duty and who wasn't. And the soldiers were actually sorted and selected, given a grade, and that told us where they were going to go, where they were going to go in the battalions, what jobs they were going to have in the military, whether or not they were fit to be deployed, so on and so forth. And as we often do in education, we saw a way to sort and select people and said, hey, works for them, it'll work for us. And we grabbed the idea and ran with it. And for a period of time in America, it worked. It was a great mechanism to sort and select which kids were going to go to college, which kids were going to go work in the factories, which kids were going to work on the farms. And we sorted and selected kids and gave them grades. The problem is, as education has evolved and as we've done more and more research and we've realized that every kid deserves the opportunity to succeed. Every kid deserves the opportunity to live within their strengths and to excel. The idea of sorting and selecting and pre-identifying a destiny based off of where a kid scores in second and third grade has become more and more ridiculous. But because it worked for some of us, because it worked for those of us that continue to work within the system, we hold on to it and we clutch onto it for fear of us indicting the system that worked for us. We don't want to look ourselves in the mirror and say the system that helped prepare me wasn't good enough. Well, the reality is it wasn't good enough. It wasn't. We do a great job in our educational system of preparing the next generation of teachers. We're doing an amazing job of identifying those kids that can play school really, really well. We do. And that's in the letter grade system, the labeling system, all of that stuff works really, really well. But it doesn't necessarily identify what kids can do, what their strengths are, what their giftings are, and what we need to do about that. And that's the issue. All of the components of grading, whether we're talking about percentiles and points, which we can go there. We can talk about weighting. We can talk about GPAs. We can talk about honor rolls. We can talk about 1,000 different things that are embedded within the way that we grade and the way that we assess and the way that we identify and the way that we label. Truly, we are forcing kids into their destinies way too early, all because of the letter grades, the stickers, the check marks, the red pen marks we put all over papers.
Well, and on top of that, it's so subjective at this point. An A in one class could be the result of any number of things that a student has done, but it all has to equate to whatever that teacher thinks makes a good student. And you can incorporate whatever you want into that letter grade or into those points as long as it's in line with what you believe makes a good student. Yeah. And so an A in one class could mean an entirely different thing from an A in another class, whether it's the same subject, it's the same grade level, what have you. They could be entirely different. That's why you have this idea that, oh, well, that teacher is a really easy grader. Like, what does that mean? Does that just like, what is that equivalent to? Instead of having like assessment measures that truly communicate what students know, can do, where they need to go next, we've got this insanely subjective system that's just based on, okay, well, this is what I equate a good student to be and what I am looking for them to do. How closely have they met my expectation? How much have they complied with what I've told them to do?
Katelynn, I love how you talk about the subjectivity of this. I was actually just having a conversation with somebody last week, and their statement to me was, well, my grades aren't subjective. I use standards-based assessments, and I don't even use letter grades. I use a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. And I said, okay, that is great. And when you use your 1, 2, 3, 4 scale, how do you determine whether or not a kid gets a 3 or 4? And they said, well, the student has to perform well on tests, quizzes, and assignments in my classroom. I said, how many questions do they have to get right to get a 3? Where did you arbitrarily come up with that number of questions right? Where did you come up with the questions to put on the test? It is all subjective. And that's not saying all assessment and all of those arbitrary measures are necessarily wrong. But I think it's important that we remember that assessment is an art form. It is subjective. It is our interpretations. We are looking at quantifiable examples of student learning, which is an attempt to try to measure the neurons bouncing around in a kid's head. That is arbitrary and it is subjective. It's an art form and we need to quit treating it like it's an objective science.
It's so true. And there are ways to make it more communicable, like ways to make it so that people can understand better, students, families, what have you, whoever's looking at it, so that it's more easily understood. But you're absolutely right. It's our subjective interpretation of what we're looking at.
So, Katelynn, how do we make it not subjective? Or is there no way to, or how do we make that better?
So I would say that instead of focusing on making it not subjective or making it objective, I would say that you should focus on your purpose for why you're assessing something. Look at what are you expecting students to do? How well have you communicated that to the students? How well have you taught that particular skill? Involve them in that process then of, okay, what does it look like to meet this goal, this learning goal that we have set? What does it look like to achieve that objective? Have a conversation in your classroom about it. It can look like building like almost a rubric that's based on a skill. But if you involve students in that process and you are able to sit down then and say, okay, we as a group and as people who are learners have determined that meeting this goal looks like this, then not only have you effectively communicated that, but you also now have an assessment measure that you can use that means something to them. So you can actually go into an assignment that you are looking at or an assessment that you are looking at for that skill and know, okay, the student has done this, so they've met that goal. They've shown me their proficiency at that skill.
So then how do we then, because then doesn't that still leave the problem of, your classroom is different than the classroom in the hall? What is their objectivity there if it's different, because those conversations are different there? So does that still, you know what I mean? Like, so do you still fall on the potential of, because you and your students might have conversations based on how you feel about something that leads to a sort of looking for a higher standard of what it means based on the conversation you had. The teacher down the hall might be slightly less, therefore making them an easier grader still.
So if it's okay for me to jump in on this, and Katelynn, I want you to explain the practical piece of this in your classroom, but I'm going to give you a real life tangible example of what you just asked, Jeff. So back in 2003, I went to law school for a while just to try to figure out how to play the game, to try to figure out how things worked in America. And one of the things I learned was that oftentimes when somebody is put on trial, they have the opportunity to go before a jury or a judge. They can say, I want one person to determine my fate, or I want a jury of my peers. And it's up to the lawyer to try to read the room and determine which way they want to go. The way it typically works in American schools is that every single student has trial by judge. They have one person that determines their fate, that says guilty or innocent, proficient or not, meeting progress, not meeting progress, as opposed to it going before a committee, a group of people that collaborate and say good, bad, or ugly. What tends to happen in American schools is one person makes that decision over and over and over again for a kid throughout the course of the year. They're assessing kids and moving on. And then at the end of the school year, the state comes in and says, okay, that was good. You were one person trying to be the judge and jury for all of your kids. We're going to put this big assessment in front of all of your kids now that a group of other people have put together, these big summative assessments. And I'm not trying to advocate for the big summative assessments, but the big end of year summative assessments put out by states were put in place because other people said that one person, that one judge wasn't necessarily giving us a fair representation of where kids were. It was very subjective. It was completely arbitrary. So we need to have something that's more standardized, more centralized, more equalized, if you will. And there are lots of flaws with that system. There are lots and lots of flaws. But if we had teachers within a building getting together and saying, what is evidence that we will accept? What is common evidence that we will accept? What might this look like if we all agree? If they were sharing work, if they were sharing assessments, if they were sharing evidence of learning, because that's all assessment is evidence of learning. If they were sharing that and they were in agreement of what quality looked like, or what the progression looked like, and what the next steps looked like, this would be solved. But because we're in such silos and we think it's our job to be judge, jury, and truly executioner, we have this issue.
Absolutely.
So then, Dave, are you advocating then that the standardized tests should be standardized at a district level or building level, or?
Yeah, so let me rewind this, because I'm sure people are going to hear this and say, "Holy cow! Did Schmittou just say we need standardized tests?" Well, what I'm trying to say is the reason we have them is because we were giving a false positive. I mean, we've all heard the term false positive now, right? We know what that means. We were giving tons of false positives, and that was the struggle. So other people stepped in and said, if you can't do it, we'll try to do it better. The issue is they didn't do it better. Their tests are flawed. The standardized assessments aren't necessarily the issue. What they measure is part of the issue. And then what we do with those results is the issue. What I think we need to do is we need to have a group of people coming together at regular intervals, looking at student work, saying, is this good? Is this bad? Is this ugly? What does this show us? And then what do we need to do about it? It's that next step that we oftentimes lose. Instead, what we do is we all come to agreement and say, is this proficient? Is this an A? Is it an F? What label are we going to give it that work? What label are we going to give the kid? Does the kid pass or fail? And then we move on. As opposed to looking at it to say, what do I need to do differently in my classroom to help students learn and progress?
That's the piece of it that's so important. And that's that action step that absolutely has to be there. And it should be there in the feedback that you're giving and the assessment that you're using. It should always be focused on what is the next step now? What are the action items that I can use as an educator that students can, what's actionable items that students can use in their feedback that I'm giving them that they can then go and move to that next level or take the next step.
So then who comes up with those next steps and to make sure that they are the best next steps for the students? Should that be at the classroom teacher level, or is that at the school level, or does that go into the standard? Where I'm trying to figure out like where the decentralization is versus the centralization. Because in the classroom, we're decentralizing the grades if we're having the conversations with the students, right? And figuring out, hey, as a class, we're agreeing to this. Does that then happen at the building level, the grade level, then again at the district level? Where does that stop? And does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yes, and the answer to your question is yes. I mean, it starts and ends with the students, the staff, the school, the district, the state. These are the conversations that need to happen. And as we said at the very beginning, when you start talking data and you start talking assessment, nobody wants to have those conversations because it means there's so much conversation and negotiation that has to happen at so many levels. Oftentimes the teachers say, I know how to assess this. And we come up with a system that makes it easy to manage the assessment. It's a 10-point quiz every single Friday. And administrators simply say, and was that quiz aligned to the standards? And you can say, yeah, the same content was there. So we're good to go and we move on. And then the state comes in and says, were your assessments aligned? Yeah, the objectives were on the board. So yeah, we're good to go. And the students are looking at the teacher saying, I have no idea why I had to take that test. I forgot it all already. And there's this lack of communication. We need to have communication, staff to students, students to parents, teacher to teacher, building to building, district to district, state to state. The conversations need to always happen. The conversations need to look like the Olympic rings. Everybody is connected.
It is such a huge undertaking too. I feel like that is why, like, we could talk in circles about this because there are so many different pieces of this that have to happen. There are so many different conversations that have to happen concurrently, that have to happen one after another, that have to continue happening because it is such a big undertaking to make this kind of shift. And it is such a big thing that you have to continue like thinking about and asking yourself, okay, is what I'm doing aligned not only to like the learning goals that I have, but to the learning goals that are going to continue on down the road? Is it aligned with the ones that came before? So am I actually assessing along a progression of learning, or am I just my own isolated little room where this is what I want my kids to do? And here we go.
So then let me ask you this. Where does, if anywhere, where does the state come in, and what is their role? What should it be? Dave, is it still possibly in the, and Kate, I mean, whoever wants to jump in, is it still in the role of the standardized test and that type of thing, but the test needs fixed, or is that entire idea and concept the part of the flawed system and that needs changed? Like what role, the conversation, what I'm hearing.
And Worms is about to, because I'm going to say something, but I'm afraid of how it's going to come across.
Let me let my head go just, and maybe that'll direct. I don't know if it'll change what you're going to say or not. But like, because I'm hearing like the conversation in the classroom, right, between the teacher and the student, figuring out like where are we at, what are we agreeing to that is our assessment, so that it's communicated, it's known, it's objective now instead of subjective. If that's happened now, also if those conversations are then happening at a department and or grade level, right? Then they also be the same. Then you take it up another level, up to the building, up to the district. Then does that then happen at the state amongst districts? Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, it
essentially
makes
what I'm
sense.
talking about is you're kind of blockchain. I don't know if you know blockchain, but essentially what you're doing is you're decentralizing everything.
Yeah. So here's the reality, and it's a reality that not a lot of us like to admit, but we like to play the blame game in education an awful lot.
We like to play that in life. That's not an education.
We do.
That's a
life. Yeah, for sure.
That's a life thing.
My examples are going to be from in education. Higher ed likes to blame the high schools and say kids aren't coming prepared. High schools like to blame the middle schools and say the kids aren't coming prepared. Middle school blames elementaries. Elementaries blame parents, so on and so forth. And yet, throughout all of this, all of those blame the states and say the states have these unrealistic expectations for our kids. They're testing our kids too much, or the standards aren't aligned, or whatever the case may be. But the reality is, and we've seen this time after time after time, regardless of the state, regardless of the expectations, regardless of the outcomes, when teachers focus on the right things, when teachers change their practices and their instructional pedagogy, when they start to assess to instruct, regardless of the standards, regardless of the big summative assessment, what it looks like, students show growth. Students show more growth in the classrooms where the teachers understand these concepts. So it's not necessarily an issue of state control or the state assessments or the standards aren't aligned. All of this, when we start talking assessments and grading, it's like we pick up the rug and we look at all the dirt that we brushed underneath it. The issue is not the assessments. The issue is not the standards. The issue is all of the stuff that we hide by not addressing what the standards what the assessments and what the grades really represent.
Wow. I love that analogy so much. Oh my God. That's amazing. And it's true though, Dave, what you said, like the idea that the teachers who are doing those things in their classrooms consistently see growth in their students, that's true on standardized tests as well. The standardized tests that we all love to hate, when you change your practice and you change your assessment and you change your focus to be on that growth and that learning and that progress, and you use assessment to instruct, to inform your instruction, your students do better on those tests that we continuously worry about, that we continuously talk bad about. There is growth there. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing to say, or even like we said before, there's no taboo topics. It works because that approach to learning works. That approach to using data to inform, that ability to look at your assessment and truly ask yourself, okay, what am I looking at here? And then what am I communicating? And what am I going to do with that?
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff.
So based on that, though, we're saying that that if you're changing the practices within the classrooms and schools, that they're performing better. They're not only seeing growth at the classroom level, which then it's then translating into actually doing better on the standardized test, right?
That's exactly what it is.
So with that, in that, and I'm sort of playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. If we agree that is true, then the standardized tests are then the way in which we make sure that those classrooms and the practices within classroom and schools are changing, or is there a better way that should be in place? Because you can make the argument, if you wanted to, that a teacher could say that they're seeing a lot of growth in their kids, but if they can't prove it via these standardized tests or some other mechanism, how do we know for sure? Because that's just subjective on growth.
Yeah. So I love the devil's advocate, but you're actually asking the right question right now, Jeff. It's when we start saying a standardized assessment, that means a couple things. Number one, it's an assessment that is based off of standards, so it's assessing the same thing. But then we've also taken that and we've kind of misaligned what a standardized assessment means. And we've also taken it and we now have a standardized medium, one way for students to show their mastery of the content. Yeah. And I think that's the struggle that most people have. You know, Katelynn and I, you as well, Jeff, we all believe in mastery-based instruction where kids have multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery, that there are multiple pathways to show it, multiple ways to demonstrate understanding. And the conflict that we have is in April and May in a lot of states when people push in their little wheeled carts with the bubble sheets and kids have to start bubbling answers, or nowadays when we pull out the Chromebooks and everybody has to start answering A, B's, and C's, that's when we have the disconnect. But what we're seeing is that some of those standardized assessments are actually catching up now, and they're more performance tasks. They're more they're more authentic. And if we can get to a place where we have more authentic assessments, even if they're standardized, where we're truly assessing standards in a uniform way, we're on the right track. Then we have to get to the point of not just using them for accountability, or probably not using them at all for accountability, but using them to say, what's next? All assessment needs to lead to what's next, not what was. That's the issue.
Yes. And it can't be used as a measure of what went wrong as well. It has to be that focus on, where do we go now? Where do we go from here? How does this information, this data inform us? How can we use that information to continue and to improve? And when you're talking about standardized assessments of any kind, it's important to consistently, continuously, constantly ask yourself about how that was written, what it is looking for, how standard are those standards, borrowing a line from you, Dr. Dave, but truly looking at, like, who is this standard for? You have to use those measures of assessment that we all know and love, the reliability, validity, and fairness. You have to make sure that your assessment is working in those three areas before we can consider it truly effective, truly standardized. And that's where I think a little bit of the nitty-gritty comes into, because it hasn't traditionally been that way, where the standardized assessments that we're using have worked for everybody, have been actual standard assessments for learning.
Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate again. Because I'm about to ask a question like I wholeheartedly do not believe, but I want to ask it because I believe what you're saying. But I've heard this asked multiple times when you talk about the standard, the standardized test not being an accountability piece. If that's not the case, how do we know who's doing their job properly or not? As a teacher, as a district, as a state, as everything, how do we figure that out?
Ooh, can I go? Can I go?
Go, Dave. Thank you.
So many ways to do this. Number one, the example, and when I hear that argument, there are so many flaws to that argument. So to use that argument, it would be, I'll just be speaking to teachers right now. Teachers, would you want your administrator to come into your classroom one day on a Friday in May and evaluate you on that one day and use that to determine whether or not you were successful or not in your ability to teach? And the answer is
no.
The answer is no. Unless it's the day that little Johnny was absent and little Susie, unless all the stars aligned. So how do you know whether or not teachers are doing their job? You get into their classrooms and you have conversations with them frequently and regularly, and you give them feedback on how to improve. How do teachers know if students are learning? They assess them frequently and regularly, and they give them steps on how to improve. It's the exact same thing.
Okay, hold on. So let me ask this now. But how do we then do that same at a district? How do we know a district's doing a job? Because technically, if that's the case, and I agree with you, but the argument is technically, if I'm the superintendent, principal, whatever you want to say, of that district, it's also subjective if I want it to be, and I can claim that because I might love it and everything's going well and things are there. So like, doesn't matter. Does someone else need to then assess us as a district or a building or however you want to look at that? And how does that work?
Jeff, you just nailed it. Well, first of all, it is always subjective. And what drives this and what this conversation is the real estate market more than anything else, to be honest with you.
Yes.
When people are choosing houses, they want to figure out what kind of schools their kids go to. Not necessarily how good are the schools and what quality are the teachers. They want to know what types of kids go to the schools, because that's what this is really measuring. It's a correlation to the types of kids that are in these schools. Because every state right now has a platform, a transparent database that you can go to and you can see teacher effectiveness ratings. If you really wanted to see how good a school was, you could go to that platform and you can see teacher effectiveness ratings for the schools in your district. But no, we want to synthesize it down and say, where's the school rate compared to other schools, so that I can make sure that my kid is going to be surrounded by other kids just like my kid. But it's all subjective. When I was in Florida, I worked at a school that they designated a turnaround school. And it was called a turnaround school because it received a score of an F for years and years and years and years in a row. It was rated an F. So the perception was this school is a hot mess. It's not doing anything right. But I'll tell you, the parents that sent their kids to that school thought that school was a saving grace. We were feeding kids. We were giving kids counseling. We were giving them social work skills. We were giving them life skills that weren't necessarily measured on the end of school, the end of year test. And the parents saw that school as an exemplary school. I saw it as a school that needed some next steps, and we were able to fix things and align things and change the grade from an F to a C, whatever that label means to people. But it was all about changing perception. And who do you want to change the perception for?
Well, and I think that you bring up a really important point there, Dave, because your school that you were working in was serving the needs of the community that it was in. And that is so important. That is what you were needing. That is what you were looking for. And so I think it's really important to consider that it was meeting the needs of that community. So in that community, it was doing its job really well.
And it's interesting. I mean, we can use this as a metaphor for the idea of grading kids. The school was graded an F, according to the state. And yes, I'm indicting you, state of Florida. Fix this. They rated a school an F. So let me tell you what that does for the recruitment of teachers for an administrator. When I go to a teacher and say, hey, I need you to come work at my school, it's been rated an F. Do you know how difficult it is to get amazing teachers to come there to say, no, I'm going to go change some destinies. I'm going to change lives at a school that was rated an F. It is hard work. I want you to then think about the kids that are in a school that have been rated an F when they know that they're going to a school that's been rated an F. When you live within that, it changes your identity. Now I want you to think about the kid who earns grades of an F in a school that's an F and what that does to their destiny. Do you think that gives them hope? Do you think it instills? And I'm not saying grades are supposed to motivate. I'm actually saying the exact opposite. We need to stop using grades as incentives to motivate or as a carrot as a stick. But when we do that, we seal destinies for kids and adults.
That's why the idea of putting a letter, an arbitrary random letter on something does not work, because it's used as a motivator, as an extrinsic motivator, as this carrot, as this stick. It's not supposed to be that. That's not what we're in the business of doing. We're not here to slap a label on something and say, here you go, have a great future, good luck. It's not supposed to be that way at all. And so when we start using this letter system that we've now, as people, attached so much weight to, what is that doing other than something that's harmful?
Katelynn, oh my gosh, are we going to go on a tangent right here? I've heard so many people, you just talk about letter grades not being incentive based, or they shouldn't be. You know, Rick Wormley says grades are communication, not compensation. And I love that line so much. But so many of us use grades and we say, well, the kids won't do it if I don't assign a grade to it. And you know what? And there are, in some places, that's the reality. So in some places, grades do drive behaviors, but a grade does not drive learning. Learning and a behavior are not always the same thing, right? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to generate learning. And I've also heard from people that, again, going back to this, that have said, I don't use letter grades. I use 1, 2, 3, 4s. I use whatever. So I can't do that. I don't care what stupid symbol you use. It's arbitrary. You can use stickers. You can use lollipops. You can use high fives. You can use ABCs. You can use 1, 2, 3, 4s. I don't care. It's still an arbitrary symbol.
Yeah, I've had that conversation before too. So I'm like, look, as a parent, like the very first thing you do is go, okay, what's the 1 equal? So that's D. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the 5? Okay, that's a A. Okay, good. You better be getting 4s. Like that's, I mean, yeah.
And the
instruction has to change, not
absolutely. Traditional grading skills already do it. You go to any high school in America and they take their letter grades and already convert it to a 4-point GPA. They're already doing it. So that's not the answer. It's not about grade transference. Transferring the arbitrary symbol you use to another arbitrary symbol does nothing. It's what does it mean? What are the values laid within it? What are you weighting? What are you placing value on? What are you assessing? Why are you assessing it that way? What instruction led to that assessment? What instruction is going to lead to that assessment? What do you believe about kids? When does learning end? When does learning begin? There's so much involved in this beyond what stupid symbol are you using.
Yes, seriously. And just to add on about like the idea of it being a behavior, I would challenge anybody who doesn't believe that that behavior can be changed to just have a little conversation with me. And I'll tell you a little bit about the gifted class that I taught a few years ago, where I completely got rid of grades altogether. That was the most challenging thing I've ever done, because if you know anything about teaching gifted kids, you know how much they love their A pluses. But when you take that out, when you remove that motivator, oh my God, amazing things happened in that class. It was, and probably always will be, one of the most powerful classes I have ever taught. And I will tell you, their behavior and their attitude about their just lovely A pluses changed so much. By the end of the school year, they asked me, I had one girl come up and go, so am I going to have to go back to like stressing about that all the time? Or do I actually get to focus on learning things still?
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, I mean, I think with many kids, but especially when you get in those kids that they're gifted and that have always gotten A's and gotten that A plus, and sometimes it's themselves and sometimes it's society that has continued to push that that's what they're supposed to get, and it moves honestly from being a motivator to a destabilizer, if that makes sense, of their self-conscious, because the second they don't get that, they now feel they're no longer worthy. They're now dumb. They're now not living up to where they're disappointing their teachers and their parents and stuff. So, that's a huge piece of that. And that's what Dave, you talked about that earlier about how like when we use them as a motivator on the other end, it's the other side, right? I'm trying to think of what I guess demotivator, right? we're showing, right? It's the same thing. Chad talks about like that circle of failure. At some point, it's a good point where I guess I'm dumb, and that's just where I'm going to be. And Dave, your example of being an F student in an F district, that way, like it just compounds over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to go too far up the nerd hill here, because I know data tells, but stories sell, right? So, but let me just use a little data. For the last 10, 15 years, some research, some scholarship has backed all this up. A lot of educators have heard about John Hattie and making learning visible, and a lot of his work in the big meta-analysis he did 12 years ago, whenever it was, where we focused on the things that work in schools. And in his research, one of the cool things he identified about his research is that 95% of what we do in schools works. That's amazing. To know that 95% of what we're doing in schools works, awesome. That means our classrooms are doing just fine. But if you were to dig a little deeper into the research and go beyond the Pinterest boards and the little graphics you can find on Google image search and actually read it, you'll realize that what he says is 95% of what we're doing works, but some things actually work better. And some of the things that have the biggest impact on student learning, one is specific and timely feedback. Another one is student self-assessment of progress. And then you can narrow it down to a lot of the things that we're talking about here, redos and retakes and student confidence, a lot of those things. And one of the things that has the biggest impact on student learning is not labeling students. If you go in and read it, not labeling students is one of the top 5 effects of things that work in schools. Something that actually has a negative impact on schools is labeling students. And this is labeling at risk, special education, gifted, you name it. Throwing a label on a kid, calling a student an A student, an honor roll student, any of those things de-incentivizes learning. Because to your point, when you start talking about even gifted students, I was labeled a gifted student back in 3rd grade, and people have heard my story. So I'm not going to go there. But when you label somebody a gifted student, it all becomes about earning points and not taking the risks and not taking the chances to actually learn things that could cost you your standing and your label of gifted. When you receive one of those other labels, it becomes this quest of, I'm not good enough, I'll never measure up. So where now is my motivation to continue to learn and take chances and take risks? When we remove those labels, we remove the stigmas, and we allow every single child the opportunity to go from beyond where they are.
All right. So I'm going to have you guys back on. Because I really want to dig in. I love where this ended up going, but I really want to dig into this. You guys got my mind just going on the idea of how do we go from a classroom up, decentralizing all this, and finding the standards that are standards amongst the people that know how to put them together, if that makes sense, so that we can figure out what is the best way to actually know that everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, that the kids are learning the way they're supposed to be learning, or going in the directions and growing like I don't even want to say like they're supposed to be, because that's not the right word, but they are showing growth, that they are growing. And how do we determine that? Because at some point you get to a point where it's like, yeah, that's great, but it's somewhere, somehow, some point, we do have to say, this teacher, this school, this district, this state is doing what they're supposed to do, and who gets to decide what that supposed to is, and how do we then assess it? Because there's so many opportunities along the way where it can be subjective versus objective, and it can become a whole political game, stuff like that. And I think there's so many pieces of there that we have to fix. And like Katelynn had said early on, there's obviously a billion conversations we have to have, and arguments and debates and research that has to come in and all these different things. Nothing's going to solve it with one piece, and certainly not overnight, or even probably by the time the three of us are all gone. But where does it? I really want to get like a whole other episode where we dive into like that whole system and where do we start, and then where do we go from there? And that's getting a little more into the politics of it and that type of thing. But that really interests me, and you guys have just sparked that in a whole new way. So I'm going to get a verbal confirmation and agreement from both of you to come back on, and we're going to have that conversation. Katelynn,
I think he's saying he wants to have a conversation on how do we focus on the focus. I think that's what I just heard him say. Yeah,
that could be the thing.
I think that's what he's saying. And yeah, I think it's interesting too, though, Jeff, that you have already kind of adapted this mindset of like, okay, I'm now interested in this and I want to keep having this conversation. I want to talk more about this. And that is where we started this entire conversation today, was the importance of having those conversations, of asking those questions, of not shying away from a topic because it makes us uncomfortable, or because it's something that we might need to learn more about, or we might need to find out more, or we might be doing something that's not so great at the time. But it's this idea that we need to have that conversation. We need to continue having that conversation. And I guess all of this to say, yeah, I'll totally come back on and talk.
Good. I like it. Awesome. So really appreciate this. This was a fun conversation. I love having these types of conversations because I don't always get to have them, being someone who was not in a classroom and doesn't have that side. So I love to kind of dig in, and you two are a lot of fun to do that with. So I consider myself very lucky, very fortunate to know both of you.
Oh, you're so sweet, Jeff.
I do. To wrap up, I do want to make sure that anyone who isn't already connected with you or doesn't realize that they can just go to teachbetter.com to find you, but maybe wants to connect you in other ways. Where's the best place for people to connect with you and maybe spark more conversations like this with you? Katelynn?
Teachbetter.com. No, I'm just kidding. You can find me on teachbetter.com, but you can also find me at all social media at KN Giordano.
I like how she says that as if everyone's gonna be like, "Oh, Giordano, I got it." Yeah, thanks. It's just like
it's like the pizza.
Like Dave, if you can spell Schmittou, you can find Dave.
There you go.
So it's the same thing. If you can spell Giordano, you can find pizza.
Yeah.
So you'd be good, right?
Well, I would also argue if you can spell Giordano, you'll find me because I'm normally commenting on the things that Katelynn posts. So feel free to just play that game too.
That's accurate too. Okay, Dave, where can we find you? Just anything Schmittou.
Teachbetter.com or at Dave Schmittou on all the things. 2 T's in Schmittou, not like there's another one out there with 1 T, but if you're looking for me, 2 T's in Schmittou.
Okay, awesome. Appreciate it. You can always find everything we talk about over at teachbetter.com. And make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And if you can leave us a rating review, really appreciate that as well. And then I would like you to keep doing me a favor. Think of just 3 people that you know that need to hear these conversations, that need to hear these stories, that need to have these conversations, that need to connect with these amazing folks and these amazing educators, and just share this podcast with them. Really appreciate it. Dave, Katelynn, appreciate you both for jumping in and having a special conversation with me. Look forward to the next one and possibly more to come after that. We'll see what happens, but thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Until next time, let's get out there and let's teach better.